Let me begin with our guests here in our Beijing studio. It's not difficult to imagine the kind of topics that are on the table, topping the agenda for both presidents, the security threats from the DPRK. But the fact is, the United States and South Korea want the same thing here, for the DPRK to denuclearize and to give up its nuclear and missile program. Where they differ is how they want to do it. The United States has insisted on preconditions, where South Korea, or at least President Moon Jae-in, has advocated a softer approach. He has expressed his willingness to engage Pyongyang when the time is right. Let me start with you, Mr. Yang. When the two presidents meet this time, how do they find that common ground? Where is the middle ground for the two presidents, and who will budge?
Well, common ground, denuclearization of the North Korea, that is the common goal and a common base for both of the capital's policies. But same goal, different approaches. Say denuclearization, but how to denuclearize North Korea, different approaches. You mentioned preconditional dialogue. Dialogue is the same between Washington, D.C. and Pyongyang, same goal, same approach, same dialogue is the must. But preconditional dialogues or some non-preconditional dialogues. So that is the different approaches. In other words, Washington wants to increase pressures on North Korea, maximum pressures. But it seems to me, new government, the new president in Seoul want to decrease pressures on North Korea so that the dialogues can be started.
Professor Hwang, what is your take on President Moon's strategy so far? What are the chances that he will take a softer approach?
Well, in fact, actually, the differences between the two right now are not that stark. Indeed, the Trump administration announced their North Korea review, and Professor Yang is correct. United States, Washington wants a stronger approach. But remember, Moon Jae-in has also said he wants to maximize pressure. At the same time, he wants to offer incentives. So, in fact, I don't think there's that much difference with with the preconditions. Even President Trump said he's willing to meet with Kim Jong-un or even talk to North Korea.
Do you see that as President Moon playing down the differences just before this trip to Washington, D.C.?
I don't think so, because I think President Trump has said so, and some of his statements have seemed contradictory. But frankly, so do Moon Jae-in's, in the sense that he wants to offer more engagement, but also maximum pressure. The key is actually not really what South Korea and Washington do, but actually how North Korea responds. You can only engage if the other side is willing to accept it. And for the last 8 years, Kim Jong-un has said no to President Obama.
Before we move on to my next question, I want to put on those graphics for you. The so-called return of sunshine policy. Mr. Moon's conservative predecessor, Park Geun-hye, who was impeached in that bribery scandal, took a hard line toward the DPRK, similar to Mr. Trump. But despite Moon's softer stance, Pyongyang's quick succession of missile tests stoked American fears that the U.S. mainland could soon be within range. What is the better and long-term strategy here? Let me give that question to Professor Lee. Will the so-called sunshine policy work in the long term?
To be fair, the jury is still out on the efficacy of the so-called sunshine policy pursued by South Korea from the late 1990s to the late 2000s. In a nutshell, it was a policy of engagement, generous aid, unconditional aid, with a view towards seeking gradual opening and reform in North Korea. In reality, North Korea has accelerated its nuclear and missile weapons program with such generous aid, billions of dollars over the past decade or so. So a return to sunshine policy would favor North Korea, and I think the U.S. would be strongly opposed to that. For now, I think the two leaders will, of course, resort to diplomatic niceties. A summit meeting is a highly scripted, choreographed affair, unlike a blind date, and I guess that's a good thing. But there is the element of the unknown, spontaneity, unpredictability coming out of President Trump. President Trump may during his many conversations with President Moon, pushed the South Korean leader on the thorny issue of THAAD, for example, and basically questioned him, whose side are you on? Obama did that with President Park 2 years ago. So I wouldn't be surprised if Trump does push President Moon a bit and try to corner him and get some answers out of him.
We will get to the topic of THAAD later in our program, but for now I want to stay on the topic of Moon's strategy. Professor Hwang, do you think the so-called sunshine policy will be long-term here, or is it a temporary policy at the start of Moon's administration?
Well, the sunshine policy's entire logic was always long-term. In fact, President Kim Dae-jung never tried to hide the fact that it was a long-term strategy of gradual transformation. And in fact, remember that Kim Dae-jung started this, implemented it, actually before North Korea's, the second nuclear crisis really began to occur and North Korea began to accelerate nuclear weapons. So to be fair, President Kim really started sunshine even before the nuclear weapons program really came to light.
Mr. Yang, your take on the effectiveness of the policy?
No, I don't think returning of the sunshine policy is possible, simply because the failure of the last 2 decades policies from Seoul. Let me put it by this way. We have 4 presidents of the South Korea. First 2 were labeled as progressive president, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. And they conducted North Korean policy characterized by de-linkage between nuclear issue and the inter-Korean relations. Let me say, any president of the RK has to meet a pair of challenges: how to deal with North Korean nuclear issue, how to deal with the inter-Korean relationship. The pair of the challenges, how to deal with the relation of the pair of the challenges. And Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun conducted a de-linking policy, say, separate dealing with nuclear issue and the inter-Korean relationship. And they were successful in improving interrelation with North Korea, but failed to deal with nuclear issue. And then moved to the conservative President Lee Myung-bak. They conducted a linkage between the 2, and so did President Park. Say, de-linking failed, and linkage also failed. So now another progressive president came into the office, say President Moon. I think he has to open a third part between the de-linkage and the linkage policy. And by his wording, he said, parallel of push forward by dialogues, improving relation with engagement with North Korea, and also push forward the nuclear denuclearization process. But theoretically, it's possible. In reality, it's quite difficult. You want to talk with North Korea, both nuclear issue and the inter-Korean relationship. But North Korea will definitely reject the subject of the nuclear issue. If you talk inter-Korean relationship, fine, okay, great. If you talk nuclear issue, no way. So how to implement the Bingjin policy, say both nuclear issue and the inter-Korean relation with North Korea? It's a really tough mission facing Moon Jae-in, the president.
For any consensus to be reached this time, for any middle ground to be found this time, there has to be a more coordinated policy between the 2 sides when it comes to the DPRK. What would that adjustment look like for both presidents this time, Professor Hwang?
Well, again, I think it's not so much the coordination between the 2. Of course, that you are absolutely correct, it's critical, but it's not nearly as far apart or different as a lot of people are making it out to be. I think Professor Yang's analysis is exactly right, and it was an excellent way of portraying this. What's interesting is President Trump seems to want to separate the nuclear issue separately from the other issues because he has made a priority. Top U.S. national security threat is missiles and nuclear weapons. And so interestingly, there is a lot more similarity between President Moon and President Trump. The final point is, again, it comes down to, it's not so much what everybody else pressures in their approach to North Korea, it's what North Korea is willing to accept. And Professor Yang is right, North Korea is saying no way. Nuclear weapons is just simply not on the table.
Professor Lee, what will it take for the United States to sit down, to engage Pyongyang?
Well, we can look to the past for some clues. The Bush administration, our viewers might recall, was very strong on rhetoric, quite hostile toward Kim Jong-il. And then North Korea escalated with its first nuclear test in October 2006. That compelled the ideologically rigid Bush administration to really concede, make all kinds of concessions, give North Korea what it wanted, a return to nuclear talks, food aid, taking North Korea off the list of state sponsors of terrorism, also delisting North Korea and allowing North Korea to collect its laundered money, $25 million held at a small bank in Macau. So it will take another major crisis, perhaps another nuclear test or a successful long-range missile test for North Korea to send a message to the Trump administration: the situation is about to get out of hand, you better come back and meet with us on disarmament talks. And that is a sure way for the US to really be reconciled to accepting North Korea as a de facto nuclear state.
Trump's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, has said the United States will use all options if it has to. Mr. Young, what does it mean, all options?
Well, theoretically...
Are we talking about more economic sanctions, military threats?
Well, theoretically, all options including, military, war. But in practice, war is a really extremely difficult option to take. So basically, I think all options now in practice means, except war, every measure could be available, including the totally contain or isolate North Korea, the banking and financial sector. That would be very vital for the sustainable economy of North Korea. So I think that although we can basically believe the probability of a war is pretty low, the situation remains quite dangerous, because if all measures except war put on North Korea, that will force North Korea to do anything they can except the war. Basically, neither Pyongyang nor Washington D.C. want to war. So we will witness a very risky game, say brinkmanship by both sides to play the game. So the following situations will be very risky.
So far, the DPRK hasn't exactly reacted well or as well as desired to any of the cards. The United States has played rhetorics, enlisting help from China, and economic sanctions. What other cards does the United States still have, and what will the DPRK react better to, Professor Hwang?
Oh, well, we, meaning the United States, has all the cards that we've always had and for decades have been really unwilling to use. Again, the emphasis on all options are on the table. I think sometimes we make too much of that rhetoric. Every single U.S. president has stated that as policy, even President Obama. And in the end, as Professor Young correctly pointed out, President Bush also had a very strong rhetoric, but in the end, he never used those military options. So it is correct that, and I think North Korea understands that. North Korea has simply been setting a pattern for the last 8 plus 16 years that it is moving more and more towards nothing that you try is going to make us move. Nuclear weapons is not on the table. And I think that North Korea will continue to do that until the message becomes clear.
Professor Lee, on the topic of THAAD, how do you think the temporary pause in the deployment of THAAD will figure in that meeting between President Moon and President Trump?
Well, this is a key issue at the summit meeting between the two leaders. Why? Because it really goes to the question of, for what is THAAD? Whom is THAAD intended to defend, protect? Is it South Korea primarily, or the 28,000 US troops stationed in South Korea? And the message coming out of Seoul, unfortunately, has been quite ambivalent. Opposition or ambivalent stance on THAAD was a very useful gambit for Mr. Moon in the run-up to his election victory in early May. It was a helpful gambit in placating Moon Jae-in's constituency, which tends to be far left and favors China over the US as South Korea's destiny. But, however, now that he's the president, for him to be wobbly on the THAAD issue sends a very unfortunate message to the United States. Just 2 weeks ago, President Moon's special advisor in Washington said that THAAD is primarily intended to defend, to protect Americans, not South Koreans, which is an absurd proposition. So I think this issue will continue to cloud the otherwise healthy bilateral relationship between Washington and Seoul.